Okay, 1 Corinthians chapter 11. A lot of good stuff. Good place to start would be with verse 1. Imitate me just as I also imitate Christ. What do you think Paul's talking about? What is he saying? Okay. Now, was that something just an apostle could say because they were inspired? Or would that be something each Christian might be able to say? What about the apostles being inspired? Does that make them easier for them than for us? Yep. Okay. Okay. Welcome. 1 Corinthians chapter 11, Paul begins by saying, imitate me just as I imitate Christ. So does their inspiration have anything to do with what he said there? Were the apostles inspired in action and when they spoke by inspiration, or just when they were speaking? See, my understanding is that when they spoke by inspiration, 1 Peter says that those people were guided or borne along by the Holy Spirit. So they got things right. 1 Corinthians 3:16, all Scripture is given by inspiration of God. So did that include actions as well as what they said or wrote? Okay. Okay. That's something we talked about recently. 1 Corinthians 9:24-27. Paul said it was possible for him to be a castaway. So if inspiration included what they did, looks like that wouldn't be possible. So we see them sinning, making mistakes, having sharp disagreements. And until they learned better, they didn't do better. And when they learned better, they still sometimes didn't do right. Acts chapter 10. Peter was up on the housetop waiting for lunch, and the sheet came down and had all manner of beasts and creeping things, and the voice said, "Rise, Peter, kill and eat." "No, I've never eaten anything common or unclean." 3 times that happened. And he later found out that what God was talking about is he should not call any man common or unclean. When he got to the household of Cornelius, he said, "You know how it is an unlawful thing for a man who is a Jew to go into one who is a Gentile. But I've learned, God showed me. So I've learned something." What you used to do? You used to think they were unclean. Now I know better. Galatians chapter 2. Paul said, when Peter came to Antioch, I was stood into the face because he was to be blamed. He essentially said, you and Barnabas are playing the hypocrite. And so here's a man inspired, preached the first gospel sermon, wrote 1st and 2nd Peter, but in his action he sometimes fell short. Acts 15:36-41, Paul and Barnabas having a sharp disagreement. And they disagreed to the extent that they went two separate ways because they couldn't get along. Okay, if that's true, and it is, then would it be okay for us to tell people, our children, our grandchildren, our neighbors, imitate me just as I imitate Christ? Would that be okay? How about printing that on your business card? Jerrie Barber, imitate me just as I imitate Christ. Phone number 615-584-0512. If in fact we did that, if we verbalized that, if we thought about that, would it make a difference in the way we act? If we knew and we were telling people, what I want you to do, imitate me just as I imitate Christ. So you think you're better than I am? No, but I'm trying to imitate Christ. And so I want you to imitate me just as I imitate Christ. And when you see me not imitating Christ, please let me know so I can do a better job of imitating Christ. If every decision, if every action, if every word, if every Facebook post were put under that guideline, what difference would it make? How many things will we post on Facebook that we like it because it agrees with us and puts down our adversary, even though we hadn't checked it for accuracy and hadn't thought about, even though it may be true, it might not be best. Make a difference. I don't know if I shared this Wednesday night sometime. I talked so much I can't remember when I said it, but within the last week or two I talked to an elder who said they had a 3-hour meeting with a lady a week ago yesterday because she's just been telling stuff on a person in the congregation, stirring up all kinds of stuff. And when they said, did you do that? Yeah, I did that. Why? Well, it's true. Sometimes it's better not to tell the truth. Not good to lie, but it's better not to tell the truth. Just because it's truth doesn't mean it needs to be told. John 16:12, Jesus said, I have many things to say to you, but you're not able to bear them yet. That's part of the discussion we're having in our society about sexual matters and when is an appropriate time to tell children about this. I saw a meme the other day. Here was a pregnant woman and her husband, and someone asked, have you found out what gender your baby is going to be? And she said, no. We've decided we're going to wait and let the kindergarten teacher tell it, or her. So, just because we need to think about what are we doing? What are we doing? What is appropriate? Imitate me just as I imitate Christ. Verse 2, now I praise you, brethren, that you remember me in all things and keep the traditions just as I delivered them to you. Interesting. What does he begin this chapter with? I praise you. This word is used 6 times in the Bible. 4 times in this chapter. Isn't that interesting? 6 times in the Bible, 4 times in this chapter. And the interesting thing is in later times in this chapter, 17, he tells them, I do not praise you. First he praises them, and then he says, I do not praise you. Maybe a good model when we get ready to criticize somebody. Find something good about them and acknowledge that. It's easy to correct children or people or brethren or anybody and just say, you messed this up, you said the wrong thing, what in the world were you thinking about? I don't know why in the world you'd do something like that. Or to say, you do a lot of good things. Need to talk to you about something and enumerate some of those good things. Okay, now we get into the good stuff. Let's read 3 through 16. But I want you to know that the head of every man is Christ. The head of woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. Every man praying or prophesying, having his head covered, dishonors his head. But every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. For that is one and the same as if her head were shaved. For if a woman is not covered, let her also be shorn. But if it is shameful for a woman to be shorn or shaved, let her be covered. For a man indeed ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God. But woman is the glory of man. For man is not from woman, but the woman from man. Nor was man created for the woman, but woman for the man. For this reason, the woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. Nevertheless, neither is man independent of woman, nor woman independent of man in the Lord. For as woman came from man, even so man also comes through woman, but all things are from God. Judge among yourselves. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? Does not even nature itself teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a dishonor to him? But if a woman has long hair, it is a glory to her, for her hair is given to her for a covering. But if anyone seems to be contentious, we have no such custom, nor do the churches of God. Okay, women, where's your hat? I warned you last week what we was going to be talking about. So, a lot of material in that. A lot of people, some people have convictions about that. We went to school with a young lady, Freed Hardeman, every day at chapel. She had a little handkerchief she put right on top of her head during chapel. I had an aunt, seemed like about every 10 years, she got convicted of that and felt guilty of sin and started wearing a hat, and then I guess she got tired of it and she'd let it go, and then a little while later she'd put it back on again. So, what's Paul saying here? There was silence in heaven about the space of half an hour. Good question. What kind of custom would it be? Okay. So what would the custom be if they had a custom? Okay? So generally what people think is saying you've got to wear something on your head, right? Interesting thing. That particular word is used only one time in the chapter. An artificial covering. So the question is it an artificial covering or is it something else? I'm going to do something I don't like to do, but I'm going to do it because it's the best thing I know to do. This is from Kaufman's commentary. Anybody use that? It's free on the internet. Burton Kaufman, if I remember correctly, started writing a commentary on the Bible when he was 65 years old. That was his retirement project. He wrote a commentary on every book of the Bible. Pretty good set, if you buy it in print. It's on the internet. He was an amazing fellow. He was a preacher to Manhattan Church of Christ for a number of years. And the story is told that one day some young people came in who didn't believe in Jesus, but they wanted to follow Buddha, and they said, "Why do you respect Jesus more than Buddha?" And Brother Kaufman started quoting Luke chapter 2. And he started quoting the genealogy of Christ that goes backward all the way to Adam. He said, "Now who's Buddha's daddy?" His wife died, and I think he was 90 or 91. He got married the second time. They gave him a big party. He was a lovable fellow, according to people who knew him. And so they gave him a big party at his wedding, and they asked him to make a statement. He said, "Well, I never like to be negative, but I really doubt if this marriage is going to last as long as the first one." Essentially what Brother Kaufman did, he read good commentaries, summarized what they said, advantages and disadvantages, and then says, "Here's what I think about it." So that's what he did. If you ever want some good information, you might want to check that out. Just go to Kaufman's commentary on Google, and I forgot the name of the website. Gail, do you remember? It's okay. Okay, let's just go through it. Take a while, but I think it's good. Verse 3, "But I would have you to know that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of the woman is man, and the head of Christ is God." In the threefold step from woman to man to Christ to God, it may appear surprising that Paul began with the center stop. But there seems to have been a design in this. Paul, who was able to speak of the subordination of woman to her husband, would first speak to man with a reminder that he himself is subordinated to Christ. In Ephesians 5:22-33, Paul made it abundantly clear that the subjection of wives to their husbands was coupled with the sternest commandments with regard to the husband's duty to his wife. In the current era, there are those who would set aside the apostolic authority regarding the question of the subordination of the wife to her husband. But the wisdom of the ages and also the Word of God concur in teaching the necessity that every organism must have a head, and there cannot be any denial that in God's basic unit of all civilization and all progress, which is the family, the head must be either the man or the woman. And God here commanded man to fulfill that function of being the head of the family. If history has demonstrated anything, it is the truism that a matriarchal society is by definition inferior. The head of Christ is God. The equality of Christ with the Father is everywhere apparent in Scripture. as Paul himself said in Philippians 2:6. But even so, the Godhead itself could not function in the project of human redemption without the subordination of the Son for that purpose. Just also, the subordination of woman to her husband does not set aside equality of both male and female in Christ, but is for the purpose of making the family a viable and successful unit. This verse makes the headship of the man over the woman parallel to the leadership of God over Christ. Thus, the same equality, unity of purpose, and unity of will should exist between a man and his wife as exists between the Father and the Son. Subordination, submission, is not inferiority, it is recognition of role. I like that verse in Luke 2 where they found Jesus at the temple. And they went through that conversation. Why in the world did you do this? Don't you know I must be about my Father's business? And it said he went back with his mother and father and was subject to them. Oh, so Jesus was inferior to Joseph and Mary. No, not inferior. He subjected himself because the law said, honor your father and mother. That's just the way God made it. Verse 4, every man praying or prophesying, having his head covered, dishonors his head. Here's where the misunderstanding of this passage begins. This clause, as rendered in the proper version, is commentary, not Bible. Having his head covered is a commentary, not a translation. Linsky translated the sense correctly. Having something down from his head. What the something is neither stated nor implied in 1 Corinthians 11:4. The logical understanding of this would refer to long hair, being long enough to hang down from the head, as clearly indicated by the apostle's words a moment later. If a man have long hair, it is a dishonor to him. The ancients accepted Paul's dictum on this and went so far as to define the length of the hair that was considered an infraction of Paul's words. Here is one person who said, the hair of the head may not grow so long as to come down and interfere with the eyes. Cropping is to be adopted. Let not twisted locks hang down far from the head, gilding into womanish ringlets. Significantly, the words hang far down strongly resemble Paul's words having something down from his head. The above is from Clement of Alexandria and was written in the 2nd century. The notion that Paul in this place referred to the shawl or skull cap worn by Jewish worshipers is refuted by the fact that the Greek New Testament does not indicate in this verse an artificial covering of any kind. This does not mean, however, that Paul would approve of the use of either in Christian worship. For Paul, such a covering probably symbolized that the Jewish male continued in spiritual darkness from which Christians have been liberated. We may therefore interpret this verse as a simple admonition that it was a disgrace for any long-haired Christian male to participate in praying and prophesying. And this interpretation certainly harmonizes with verse 14. History has certainly vindicated this view because universal human behavior has departed from it only in isolated instances and for relatively very short periods of time. Every man. It is wrong to understand this generic sense as every man or woman. There are two Greek words for man, one as a human being and the other contrasting man with woman or child. The latter form is used for man in every instance in this chapter. Verse 5, but every woman praying or prophesying with her head unveiled, this is a revised standard, the only one I could find. I have the translation of 8 or 10. That's an interpretation, not a translation. Every woman praying or prophesying with her head unveiled dishonors her head, for it is one and the same thing as if she were shaven. Lipscomb said, in all the history of Christ and the apostles, no example is found of women speaking publicly or leading in public prayer, although they were endowed with miraculous gifts and did prophesy and teach and prophesy in the family circle. However, McGarvey construed this passage as an example of women when exercising the prophetic office in the church. We may suppose that the Corinthian women affected to perform such offices in public assemblies or pretense of their being inspired, and though Paul did not here condemn the practice, he does follow that he allowed it. It does not follow that he allowed it or was allowed in any church. We'll look at that in chapter 14. A lot of people say, well, here's your example. Women can do that. Man, that is a deal. Have y'all been reading about the Southern Baptists? They're struggling with this. They recently disfellowshipped some people or dismissed them from their association who are having women pastors. So that is a big issue. They've lost a bunch of churches and a bunch of people because of that. So a lot of people say, well, 1 Corinthians 11 said women were praying and prophesying, so that means they did it in public, so well, let it do too. And then he says in 1 Corinthians 14, no, let the women keep silent in the church, in 1 Timothy 2. So I would think that Paul, under inspiration and consistency, would not allow something in chapter 11 that he would condemn in chapter 14. With her head unveiled, the word here rendered unveiled is there is no intrinsic meaning in this verse which suggests either the covering material or the object covered. It is simply a general word. It means covered completely. It means not completely covered. Thus again, the passage falls short of mentioning any kind of garment. Suppose that Paul here meant mantle or veil or any such thing as to import into this text what is not in it. We've seen he was here speaking of hair, and that is exactly what he's speaking of here. Not completely covered would then refer to the disgraceful conduct of the Corinthian women in cropping their hair after the manner of the notorious Corinthian prostitutes, which, if they did it, was exactly the same kind of disgrace as if they had shaved their head. It is crystal clear that Paul is not speaking of any kind of garment, because it said in 1 Corinthians 11:15, for her hair is given to her instead of a covering. Her hair is given to us for, and the word literally means instead of. We'll look at that a little more in detail later on. If she does that, if she is uncovered, she dishonors her head. Understanding the unveiled in the preceding clause as a reference to cropping her hair explains this. Any man's wife adopting the style of the notorious priestesses on the Acrocorinthus would bring shame and dishonor upon her head, that is, her husband, who would thus be scandalized in the conduct of his wife. Also from this it is clear that 1 Corinthians 11:4, man's head, which is Christ, is the one dishonored here. Thus the thing which Paul condemned here was the arrogant adoption of the hairstyle by women of the shameless priestesses of Aphrodite. Is there any lesson for modern Christians in this? Indeed, there is. Any time that Christian men or women adopt styles, whether clothing or hair, which are widely accepted as immoral, antisocial, anti-establishment, or in any manner degrading, such actions constitute a violation of what is taught here. Verse 6. For if a woman is not veiled, let her also be shorn. But if it is a shame for a woman to be shorn or shaven, let her be veiled. Here again, the sense of this place is destroyed by the traditional rendered veiled. No artificial covering of any kind has thus been mentioned by Paul in this chapter, nor will there be any reference to any kind of garment or artificial covering until 1 Corinthians 11:14. Below, where it is categorically stated that her hair is given to us instead of any other covering. Paul is only repeating here the obvious truth that for a woman to adopt the Aphrodite hairstyle was the same thing as being shaven. The shaving of any woman's head was considered either a sign of deep mourning or fitting punishment for adultery. And the overwhelming inference here is not that the Corinthian women had thrown off the Oriental style veil that obscured almost all the female person, there being no evidence at all that first century Christian women ever wore such a thing. But they had adopted the chic hairstyles of the women of Aphrodite. Can it be believed that Paul was here pleading for the Corinthian women to put veils in the style of present-day Muslims, when it was about to say in 1 Corinthians 11:15, below that the hair had been given to her instead of such a covering? It is the flagrant mistranslation of this passage which has obscured the truth and confused millions of students of it. Verse 7. For a man ought not to have his head veiled, for as much as he is the image and glory of God, but the woman is the glory of the man, for the man is not of the woman, but the woman of the man, for neither was the man created for the woman, but the woman for the man. He ought not to have his head veiled. The true meaning is a man ought not to have anything hanging down from his head. An obvious reference to long hair is more thoroughly explained. Whatever covered means in 1 Corinthians 11:4 must also be the meaning of veiled in this verse. Moreover, the fact that Paul is speaking of something fundamental and intrinsic in human appearance and not merely about some kind of clothing is inherent in the reasons assigned to support his words. In these verses, the big thing in view is the eternal propriety of woman's submission to her husband, a subject already made in Paul's mind from the reference to man as head of the woman. The facts of creation reveal that woman was taken out of man, she was given to man, she was created for man, and she was intended to be the glory of man. The scandalous behavior of the Corinthian women had contravened God's purpose in all these things, hence the mention of them here. Charles Hodge stated, in this way does the New Testament constantly authenticate not merely the moral and religious truth of the Old Testament, but its historical facts, and makes the facts the grounds or proofs of great moral principles. For this cause ought the woman to have a sign of authority on her head because of the angels. This verse should be read without the words a sign of, the same being not in Paul's writings and all, but having been merely added by the translators to help out what they concede to be the meaning of the passage. If we're looking at King James, New King James, when you see words in italics, that means we supplied these because we think it gives better sense, not that it's part of the original. As Farah said, a great deal of irrelevant guesswork has been written on this verse. We shall not trouble the reader with any of the wild guesses concerning the danger that women without veils might tempt some of the angels attending church and seeing them, or any such speculations. The simplest explanation, since Paul was speaking of proper subordination of women, is that this is a reminder that the angels who kept not their first estate lost heaven, and it is not far-fetched to draw the analogy that those precious angels called women should not go beyond the limitations imposed upon them by their creation. Authority on her head. Scholars do not agree on the exact meaning implied by the use of authority here, but it's clear that Paul referred to the woman's head covering, woman's head being properly covered. But it is of the utmost importance to note that the nature of that covering is not here specified. The opinion of this writer is that the reference means she should not have her hair cropped, even in such a regulation as that. The implication is that the prohibition is not absolute but qualified. The sin was not in cutting of the hair, but in cutting it off in such a manner as to obscure the sexes or to intimate the shameless prostitutes of the pagan temple. Verse 11, nevertheless, neither is the woman without the man, nor the man without the woman in the Lord. For as the woman is of the man, so the man also by the woman, but all things are of God. Despite the facts of Paul speaking on the subordination of women in God's order of created being, he was careful here to point out what kind of subordination he was speaking of. Man and woman are mutually dependent upon each other, each enjoying unique prerogatives and blessings under the will of God, as Paul stressed in Ephesians 5:22-33. While true enough that the first woman was made out of man, it is true that all others since then, that they are born of woman. The natural relationship between men and women, like everything else, is ordained of God. Johnson believed that the point of the emphasis here is that man must always remember that he exists by a woman and that both are of God. Judge ye in yourselves. Is it seemly that a woman pray to God unveiled? There's an appeal to the decision of their instinctive sense of propriety. Johnson believed that seemly here should read proper. It should be noted again that unveiled has no reference at all to what is referred to as a veil. The word is exactly the same as used in 1 Corinthians 11:5. A covering of some kind is meant, but the Greek text leaves totally out of sight anything that would enable this to be identified as some kind of artificial covering or man-made garment. The instinctive judgment of men is much more easily associated with their approval of long hair for a woman than the whole approval of some kind or style of clothing. Fallibility of human instinct is that the whole area of concern is proved by the new styles accepted every spring. Doth not even nature itself teach you that if a man have long hair, it is a dishonor to him? The fact of short hair for men and long hair for women is a divine suggestion in nature itself. It is quite evident throughout this whole paragraph that Paul is talking about hair, not clothes. If such is not the case, such a verse as this is totally out of place. The judgment of history as well as the New Testament confirm Paul's words here are true. People may deny it if they please, but the sacred text and the usage of the century are against any such denial. Verse 15, but if a woman have long hair, it is a glory to her hair, for her hair is given her for a covering. It is a glory to her. This would have been the ideal place for Paul to have said that a mantle thrown over a woman's head and shoulders is a glory to her, if he ever had such a thing in mind. On the contrary, it comes out here, as it does in every other verse in the whole passage. The subject was hair. Her hair is given to us, her for a covering. Here again is an erroneous mistranslation, and one may wonder at the efforts of commentators to make this conform to the misinterpretations they have foisted upon this innocent passage. Johnson says, this does not mean that her hair is her covering, but a glance at any interlinear Greek New Testament reveals the meaning instantly. Nestle gives it instead of a veil. Her hair is given her instead of a veil. The idea covered by instead of is that the noun preceding this preposition is available. The noun following the preposition is not required. Therefore, the conclusion is quite inescapable that if a woman's hair conforms to apostolic standards of propriety, she requires no artificial covering. But of paramount importance in this verse is the noun here rendered veil. This is the one noun in the whole passage that unmistakably refers to a head covering. Thayer says it is a covering thrown around, a wrapper, that is the veil, which has already been imported into the passage 5 times. But this is Paul's first reference to anything of the kind, and significantly it is mentioned in the same breath with woman's hair, which is given to her instead of any such covering. The only conceivable situation in which it may be inferred that Paul expected a woman to wear the kind of mantle or veil spoken of here would be the one in which a woman's hair has been lost from disease, accident, or something of that kind. Eccles thought that it was instead of, in this verse, forces us to accept the alternative that if a woman's hair does not fulfill its proper function, then she should wear a mantle or hood. However, this seems to be an unnecessary conclusion, since the natural modesty of almost any person would lead to wearing of a head covered in such a circumstances. Okay, I apologize for the long reading. I don't like that, but I didn't know any other way to summarize. Questions, comments, observations? Yes, sir.
In the 40s and 50s, you go to worship service, and you very few women didn't have a hat and a veil on.
Yep.
And the young ladies, I don't remember them having all that. They got big womanhood while everybody had a hat. Maybe they didn't want to take no chance on it.
Yeah, well, I mean, when you got the word veil in there, you get to thinking about that. Yeah, yep. Yeah. Okay, questions, comments, observations?
Why do Jerry, like a lot of ladies, I mean, they enforce this, or they, I guess for conscience sake,
Yeah.
you should do that.
I don't think it's wrong to do that. I mean, nowhere does he say it's sinful to wear that.
But what about saying it is sinful if you don't?
Well, that's, I'm hoping to get 2 or 3 nights to work on this, the Sermon on the Mount. I've been talking to you. I woke up a few Saturdays ago thinking about that. It was written to us individually. And y'all going to hear it. You say, we've already heard that. We're going to hear it again, Lord willing, before I leave. But I want to go through the whole Sermon on the Mount. The multitudes came to them, and when he was said, he opened his mouth and said to them, saying, and he started that. Multitudes, but you know who he was speaking to? One at a time. And in the Sermon on the Mount, over and over again, it is mentioned that perfection is the goal. We're following Jesus. Jesus said we need to dot it. He said, before I go back, I'm going to dot every T, dot every I, and cross every T. He says, be perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect. That needs to be our goal. We don't say, well, we're not going to do it right, so this is what I'm going to do wrong today. No, bad attitude. Bad attitude. However, we're not going to hit that. We're not going to do that. How do I know? The Bible tells me so. 1 John 1:8. If we say we have no sin, we deceive ourselves and the truth is not in us. What in the world are we going to do? How can we be good enough to go to heaven? Don't worry about it. You can't. You're not going to be good enough to go to heaven. How are we going to get there? For by grace you have been saved through faith, and that not of yourselves. It is the gift of God, not of works, lest any man should boast. How long and how regularly does that operate? 1 John 1:7, if we walk in the light just as he is in the light, we have unbroken fellowship with one another, and the blood of Jesus, his Son, continues to cleanse us from every sin. And many people are in the idea, if you disagree with me on one thing, we got to start a new church because this church is unsound and unscriptural. And so we'll have hat churches and no hat churches and all the different things we divided over. And the only way to have unity with that mindset is to go to the most conservative position in the world and everybody conform to it. Only way we'll ever be united. With that rule, which I think is not a biblical rule. One of the reasons I enjoy studying 1 Corinthians is that you have a church which is messed up in every way you can think of. Attitude, action, immorality, marriage, worship, doctrine, you name it, they messed it up. Lord's Supper. And nowhere, 1 Corinthians 1 through 16, does Paul say, okay, bottom line, here's what you do. You good people need to pull out and start the sound Church of Christ in Corinth. These folks are hopeless. That's not his prescription. He said, here's some things. I praise you, but then he's going to say 2 or 3 more times before the end of the chapter, I don't praise you for this. Y'all getting drunk during the Lord's Supper. That's not a good idea. Not a good idea. Don't do that. And so he tries to correct that. The one person he says to disfellowship, withdraw fellowship from, deliver to Satan, is a man living with his father's wife. And so that to me is the good news of 1 Corinthians. And so, if we have to agree on everything, and if wearing a hat or any other the divisive doctrines that people have come up with, if it becomes to the statue of the divinity of Christ and that Jesus Christ rose from the dead, if it's important as that, we're hopeless. We had a man here a few Sundays ago talking with me. He's looking for a church that follows the Bible. I said, wonderful. He said, now I believe the world is flat. And he said, I'm looking for a church that teaches that. He hadn't been back. If we would have, maybe if I'd have preached a sermon on that, he might have come back, but I can't find that, so I won't do that. Okay. I'll be gone next week. We want to get into the section on the Lord's Supper. Selfishness at love feast. We won't talk about that. There's 2 or 3 references in the Bible that indicated that they probably had a meal each Sunday. They had a love feast. They would come together. They didn't have Sunday night worship for those who weren't able to partake this morning. They had Sunday night service because many of them were slaves and they worked all day long, and that's all they had was Sunday night worship. And so, according to what we read, is that they brought their food and ate. But in Corinth, they said, no, you're not getting any of my banana pudding unless you're kinfolks. And I'd have trouble associating with somebody who wouldn't let me eat their banana pudding. So there's where you get division. Okay, let's start there the next time.